Well, welcome everyone. It's good to be here. I'm glad, so happy that you could attend, and for anyone who's online or watching later, thank you so much for joining us. As we begin today, I think it's important to acknowledge that this place and the people who are here share a story. King's University at Western is located in close proximity to three vibrant local First Nations who have long-standing relationships with the land and the place that we now know and recognize as London, Ontario. Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, which is part of the Anishinaabe Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, part of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, part of the Lenni Lenape Nation, which we'll celebrate today. Historically, the Attawandaron neutral peoples also once settled in this region alongside the Algonquin and the Haudenosaunee peoples and used this land as their traditional beaver hunting grounds. Today, a diverse and growing Indigenous population live in London and the surrounding areas. We are all treaty people, along with all of the responsibilities and the duties that entails. And so it's important to remember that we share this land, that we share in the responsibility of care for this place that we inhabit for a time. And we share the task of sustaining respectful and meaningful relationships with those around us, particularly with those who suffer from unjust structures. Miigwech. Well, my name is Jim Pancho. I'm the Director of Campus Ministry here. And just very briefly, we were planning our Remembrance Day events, and I suggested we should find a way that we could give voice to the often hidden sacrifices of Indigenous soldiers. And so I was so pleased that Dr. Graham Broad introduced me to Terry King. And this lecture is a result of that conversation. So it's a story that needs to be told. That's what I said to Terry. And I think it's a story that we need to hear. So I'd like to invite forward now Katrina Passerbeck to introduce our speakers.
Thank you very much. My name is Katrina Passerbeck, and I am an instructor in the Department of History, and it is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Today we gather on Remembrance Day, which marks the 103rd anniversary of the armistice of the First World War. Among those who served over a century ago were 4,000 Indigenous soldiers. Today we will be introduced to one named Private Arnold Logan by two of his relatives, who themselves are dedicated educators, researchers, and advocates in the community. A member of the Munsee Delaware First Nation, Ian McCallum has worked in education for over 20 years. He is an education officer in the Indigenous Education Office for the Ministry of Education in Ontario. As a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, his research focuses on the best strategies for Munsee language revitalization. A member of Bosoel First Nation, Terry King is a second-generation residential school survivor with mixed ancestry with relatives who are Lenape, Potawatomi, Irish, and British. While completing her undergraduate degree here at King's, Terry began researching the life of Arnold Logan and was given the opportunity to present her research to the Minister of Veterans Affairs in 2020. Today, Terry works with Atlocha Family Healing Services Homelessness Division to support community through the impact of ongoing forms of colonization. She has worked in London's emergency shelter systems for the last 7 years and believes that all community have the right to social equity and safe, attainable housing. Please join me in welcoming Ian and Terry to King's.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Welcome to all of you today. Ian and I are really excited to be here. So I'm going to, although the introduction was fantastic, I'm going to reintroduce myself to all of you out there. So Koinga Newel Noma, Nin Tashinzi, Terry, Nin Nonjiayi, Nalahi, Walk Waishipwe Walk, Chimna Singh, Walk Britain, Walk Ireland, Lotamu, sorry, Shuknawikinian, London, Lo Tuman, Woondak Takwak, Bojo, Bungi Atago, Ninata Anishnabem, Ninga Gojitun, Anishnabe Moyen. Wasayaben Indigenous Mikanakdin Nodem, Chimdasing Nindonji, Niminawaya, Gaye, Nimina Wendum, Aye Noma Nogum, Miu, Miigwech, Bizendawieg. So what I said is my spirit name is Brightening at Dawn. My English name is Terry. I am from Chimnasing, Bosalil First Nation, otherwise known as Christian Island, and I follow the ways of the Turtle Clan. Like Katrina had said, I have relatives who are Irish, British, Lenape, Potawatomi, and Anishinaabe. And with that, I also said that I'm really happy to be here and that I'm feeling really good and that I only know a little bit of the language, but I'm going to try to speak a little bit of the language today. And so with that, thank you for listening, and I'm going to pass it over to Ian.
Anishik Terry, Anishik Kings for the invite. I'm only going to be able to do it in the Munsee language. I'm not going to be able to do it in the Anishinaabe, but I'll introduce myself in the language for everybody. Wailik Kishkwik, Wamawen, good afternoon, everybody. Nidashinzi Wabanachka, Ninonjai Nalahi, Shuknawikian Berry, Nawalotaman Wundak Takwa. Mechki Shaptone. So I am, my name is of the people. I'm from Munsee, Delaware, and I follow the ways of the turtle. And I'm done speaking my introduction. Anishi. I guess before I click the next slide, we'd just like to offer the chance to get to know a young man who only lived not even up to his 20th birthday. And it's a relative that we both share. He's our great uncle, and he's from Munsee, Delaware. So that's where he was born and raised and spent part of his life in St. Thomas before he went across to England and to France.
Yeah, and so today, Ian and I are just going to be sharing our great uncle's story, and we're going to have a conversation about it. So I'm really excited to have all of you just listen to the conversation that Ian and I have talking about Arnold and some questions that we still have. And yeah, just relax and listen to the story and take it away, Ian.
Yeah, it's nice to actually have somebody else to talk to about with Arnold, because he's been someone I've researched since I was a grade 13 student. We had what was called history fair projects, and rather than build a diorama of something that was not going to have the same meaning, I decided at that point that I was going to start a journey to get a better understanding of who Arnold was, because he didn't live long. There were some stories in the family that we are aware of. But he was a very unhighlighted person in our family that we just didn't know much about. So it's been almost a 31-year-old journey now of me learning about Arnold. And it's so wonderful to have a relative, a cousin who's able to join me in that research, because now we get to find more out about this man who lived only till his 19th year. The picture up on the screen shows the actual house that Arnold was born in and grew up before he left to go to the Mount Elgin Residential School. The cabin actually still exists at Longwoods Conservation Area. So it's still there. And it's an amazing piece of history, because it was built somewhere prior to 1840. And it is witness to at least 3 generations of the Logan family. And then after, it was given to the Dolson family. So it's had a long history of, I guess, it's seen a lot in its time, where it saw Indigenous people shift in terms of how they lived and how they practiced their ways. It saw a shift where people would speak the Indigenous language and then were forced to learn English. But it's the only family home that I have that's well over 200 years old that I can I can touch, right? Like I can see, and you could walk in and you can almost hear the voices and you can hear, the history and the culture within the building. Arnold was born in 1896 in this building to Isabel and Scobia Logan. And it was a busy household. There was there was two other brothers, Willis and Alonzo, older brothers, and then a half brother, Fred, as well. And in the mix, there's also a sister, Alma. And the household was actually run not by Scobia, who had pressing duties as chief of the community, and he was a frequent traveler to Detroit, and he made his way over to England to meet the Queen. So it was actually run by his father, Henry Logan, and Henry was born on the Thames in about 1810. So the language of the house wouldn't have been English completely; it would have actually been Munsee. So you've got a very a household that spoke the Indigenous language, and the stories that would have been in that house of the Munsee people and their migration from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, the conflict with the Americans, the conflict with the Haudenosaunee people over the times, would have all been part of what went on in that house.
Yeah, and how amazing that it still exists, that we can go out there and, peer through the windows, touch the outside, and just imagine all of the different interactions over the years that had happened in that house. And it's really, during my research, so just to give a little bit of context, I know in the introduction, it was said that I came across Arnold when I was doing a research project in my undergrad. And prior to that, I had no idea who Arnold Logan was. So doing that project, I came across the information that was actually related to the soldier that I was researching. And in turn, that brought me to Ian and his family, who had a wealth of information, and they welcomed me in immediately as cousins. And it's really exciting to be able to make that connection through just, the simple act of, okay, I'm going to research an Indigenous soldier. But then through that process, well, that Indigenous soldier is actually my great great uncle. And so that was, such a fantastic thing for me to find that connection and to be here to share that story. And more importantly, to be here with Ian as my relative to share the story together.
Yeah, that's an awesome coincidence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and so we do know that Arnold attended Mount Elgin Residential School, which is just outside of London here. So for those of you who may not know how close it is to the area where we reside, it's about 40 minutes just down the road. And so he probably started that school, maybe around the age of 10 or so. We guess that he was probably just at home as a child, but we do know that his dad was educated. Education was probably important for the family. And so he did spend some time at Mount Elgin. After I think a couple of years, so we speculate that he was probably there from the age of 10 to maybe 14. After that, he moved on to the railway, but yeah, do you have anything to add about his time in residential school?
No, the records are fairly scant in terms of his time, but his dad was an ardent believer in the Conservative Party of Canada, which is counterproductive for Indigenous people at the time, I would argue. But his dad used to write letters to John A. Macdonald personally, and we have copies of those. So his dad was I think a believer in terms of the education that was offered at Mount Elgin, and that Arnold and his two other sons plus his daughter all sort of attended there just after the turn of the century.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that is important to say is we're calling Mount Elgin a school, but in no way was it really a school. These institutions were more like labor camps. And although we don't know exactly what his experience was in Mount Elgin, we do know that it likely wasn't the most pleasant. And this is just a stark reminder that there was a lot of Indigenous children who spent time in these institutions, not so much for learning, but for labor. And so here in the photos, you can see a picture of some boys just outside of Mount Elgin digging the water pipes. And I was looking online and I came across an old schedule from the 1850s. And for the children who attended these institutions, labor or like physical labor was expected for up to 6 to 8 hours out of their day. And so I just wanted to bring that to light because most recently, like we've had all those little ones who have just been found. And it's really important to keep that in mind that these weren't schools and to be more cautious around maybe that use of the word school, and I prefer to call it an institution.
Surprisingly, we have family photos, and family photos are fairly unique, I would argue, for Indigenous people at this time, because of course photos cost quite a bit of money, and the family was not well off. So in front of you here are three members of the family. So we've got Alma Logan, who became an actress and moved to Detroit in 1915. You have Arnold, who's sitting down, and then you have my great-grandfather Alonzo on the far right. We suspect that this photo would have been taken after Arnold had completed his time at the Mount Elgin Institute. What we don't know is whether this was actually a family photo of him before he left for France, because there's several photos that you'll see where his physical appearance changes a bit, where it looks like his time on the railway has done him really well in terms of his upper build. And here he maybe looks a little bit younger than what would be expected of an enlisted soldier. So we're still figuring out when this picture was actually taken. And then not pictured in the photo is an older brother, Willis, and then a half brother, Fred, who's Terry's relative.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I really enjoyed this photo because they are really dressed up. Like their clothing is super fancy. It looks super awesome, and it's always been a curiosity since I've first seen this photo as to like what was the intention behind this, right? We also have other photos of Arnold. And so like we know that they got their photo taken not just like once as a family, which were, there's some family members who are even missing out of this, but multiple times, right? And yeah, I just, imagine looking at this, like what were they doing that day? Like walking down the street in their like ultra fancy outfits, getting their pictures taken, or was there some event that was happening afterwards, right? There's so much speculation, but the imagination can go wild with looking at this photo, but it's fantastic. Yeah, and so we do know after residential school or after being at Mount Elgin Institute, we do know that Arnold, by the time he was probably about 16, would you say? Yeah, he had joined the Pere Marquette Railroad in St. Thomas, and so he got a job there as a fireman. So not the traditional fireman that we think of today, but somebody who shoveled coal into the train. And it was here that he met a really good friend of his that we will talk about later on in the presentation. But yeah, if we go to the next slide, we can see some questions to some some answers to some interview questions for the railway. And I think that it's really awesome just to see his handwriting here and to see some of these answers. Although Ian said you may have the questions somewhere, but I was like going through this last night, and so I transcribed some of these answers. I think I have it written down here, and just trying to envision like what were these answers to. So for instance, question or answer number 126 is go slow, be prepared to stop if the train doesn't start. The answer to question number 127, division officials, track foreman, and brakesman. And then what I thought was kind of humorous was the answer to question number 130 is just a simple no. So like, what was the question there that he just wrote? No. But maybe someday we can see those questions so we have a better context of what the answers are here. But this is just another really rich piece of documentation that Ian was able to gather. I guess you got this quite a while ago, these.
Yeah, it's finding in railway employee records back in I'm going to say it was the very early 1990s, was a very involved process of using old style technology such as a phone and mailing letters and things like that. It wasn't like instantaneous where you could look it up online and find things. So, I had to look through American railway records because Père Marquette is an American company that was bought out by the Michigan Central Railway, and you had to follow the sort of the path of which railway bought out which railway in order to find his records. And it was a surprising find because we didn't assume that you'd actually get his test to allow him to become an employee in the Père Marquette. And that's his handwriting, and those are his answers to questions so that he could become employed. And of course, it's a family business, so his brothers were all railway engineers. And I guess that sort of is part of the whole St. Thomas experience, right? As being that railway city, that was a major employer in town.
Yeah. And so I alluded to the best friend. And so the next slide is talking about that best friend, Ernest Biggs. And so it's unclear whether they met at the railway or they also were members of the 25th Regiment, which is the militia club in St. Thomas. And so they were active members of that regiment up until they signed up for World War I. And so it's unclear whether they met there or whether they met at the railway, but they did become lifelong friends, even though their friendship was very short because, as we'll get to it, Arnold doesn't survive the war, whereas Biggs does. But their friendship had a lasting impact on Biggs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But did you have anything to add to?
Yeah. Other than like Ernest Biggs is a recent immigrant, actually. He's from England. So he has come across the ocean and landed in St. Thomas and is now working on the railway. And Arnold is an Indigenous man from Muncie, Delaware. So, I mean, the social part of St. Thomas at this time must have been fairly interesting where these two have connected and yet come from totally different backgrounds. So with the power of new technology, we're able to zoom in on Arnold's big group photo. In the 1980s, there was a house fire on the reserve with my Aunt Arnold's place. In that was actually Arnold's single photo before he went into the army with his full army gear, but also the letters that he wrote home. So unfortunately, it was a big loss in terms of piecing some things together about Arnold. But we've been able to find pieces through the Elgin County Museum that have done a wonderful job in terms of offering pictures of that first 100 soldiers who signed up in southwestern Ontario in the Elgin area, Elgin County area. And they've sort of got different street scenes because, of course, it was a big deal, right? This is the country's answer to the call of the empire of England needing soldiers. And this is the best that we can send right now. This is the first group of people that we can send right now. So with the power of being able to zoom in and actually capturing individual people within a crowd, we've actually been able to isolate Logan's picture, Arnold's picture, within the entire group shot of the first 100. So it gives you a different perspective of the way he looked on, sitting to now after a year shoveling coal for the Père Marquette. He looks a little bit more defined, and that's going to actually be part of what Terry and I will share in another couple of slides. So it's important that that's part of this. But you'll see them marching down Talbot Street. He is one of the fellows in the pith helmet because he's actually got the pith helmet in the big photo. And they're getting ready to board. I would argue it's got to be the London Port Stanley Railway because they went from St. Thomas to London and they met up with the larger group of recruits from this area before they shipped off to Valcartier. So, whether it's an indirect or direct, you've got a picture of him, but you've actually got a picture of him somewhere in the crowd before he actually left St. Thomas, the city he'd only lived in for a year and a half, before he ships off for Valcartier.
And just how exciting, I mean, I think if we go to the next slide, we see the excitement and that, oh, I guess it's not that one, but it'll be coming up soon. Yeah, just how exciting it must be from going, from a small town to having all of this excitement and all of these people gathering around you to wish you well in this new adventure. And we oftentimes think that, like, yeah, it's this adventure that's really exciting to be able to get to travel the world, but did they really understand what they were signing up for at this time, right? And so, yeah, I guess we can talk about this slide before we get into more of that.
Sure. And I think this is a picture outside the Elgin County Court building in St. Thomas. So they got the big group photo of all the guys that are going to go to Valcartier to attest. I don't think all of them actually made it, and that we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But to highlight, we're actually using his story for the basis of like a graphic novel. So the artwork to the right-hand side is actually being created right now to support the different aspects of Arnold's life that we're sharing today. So we're documenting it and creating something more meaningful for the community and for Canada as a whole, in terms of highlighting one of the very first Indigenous soldiers to enlist in World War I.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the photo that I was talking about. So Ian tells me that this photo was taken in St. Thomas. And so even today, when I think of St. Thomas, I don't even think there's that many people in St. Thomas, let alone back in the early 1900s. But that just really paints the picture really well of, the pride that they would have for those who have volunteered for this great effort, for this great war. And how excited they were to send people off. And yeah, so this was, well, I guess it would have been 1914.
Yeah, and I think it's somewhere Talbot Street and where the LNPS tracks cross Talbot. So it's right in the center of town. I don't know if it's called Hiawatha Street, but right where the St. Thomas Times Journal was published is essentially, I think, where this photo was taken before they went to London. And of course, he's somewhere in the audience, so it's nice to see you. You're like, we don't know where, but we know that he's got one of those helmets on and he's out there. And just it must have been quite exciting for a guy from Muncie, Delaware Nation, a very small community, rural community, to now being surrounded by people all wishing you well, right, on your journey. Good luck. We're in total support of you. This must have been fairly overwhelming for him to be part of this crowd.
Yeah, and so Ian had already alluded to this, and he's got big shoes to fill here, being of the male lineage. But yeah, they are off across the sea onto this effort. But before they are able to do that, they have to pass a physical test. And so I do have it here. So when he was examined in Quebec, Dr. Guest, who examined him, writes, "The most perfectly formed man so far examined is Arnold Logan, an Indian from Muncie. In build and physical condition, he is considered to be a perfect model of a man." And so, yeah, I think that he never lived that down amongst his friends. And we do have some comments that his buddy Ernest Biggs brings up in direct relation to this quote. This just kind of stems from, there's this the saying that, like, Muncie people are really special people because, like, there are lots of actresses and athletes and singers, and there's a lot of talent and apparently a lot of really good looking people. And we do know that Arnold's sister, like you were saying, was also an actress, and then the brothers were in the railroad. We just imagine this beautifully looking man who, like Ian was saying, started out looking as like a little boy, to, in a very short period of time, because of the railroad and then this excitement, looking more like a man and making his way across the sea. And Ian, you did talk about it. His dad, at this time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, I guess it would have been more like the 1800s, late 1800s, that his dad Skabaya had crossed the sea. And so how exciting for, somebody who comes from this small town from Muncie and then living in St. Thomas to be able to be following somewhat the footsteps of his father and crossing the sea over to England, right? Where maybe, that would not have been possible at any other time in his life.
Yeah. And you got to believe everything that the St. Thomas Times Journal says and reports, right? So this article is the truth. But I mean, it's an interesting article because it's a sidebar. It's a piece that was found out later that you would never get from his attestation form. In his attestation form, he is listed as swarthy, which is sort of a slang for the fact that you have dark skin. He's 5'7" or 8". He's not very tall, right? His eyes are brown, and there's not a lot of details in those attestation forms that would lead you to what he was described as by a medical examiner for the Canadian Army, right? And so it's an interesting extra piece that you would never have known about this man. And uncommon also for attestation forms is he can sign his name. So it does show the level of education that he had in order to work on the railway that he was able to receive, and also being able to read and write. So his attestation form is filled out by himself when he needed to sign it. So that's another important piece, that he was able to interact and work in a world that was dominated by the English language at the detriment of his own. But his own language will come back in a couple of slides.
Yeah, that's. Oh, yeah. And so these are his papers. And so you can see what's written a little bit about what Ian was saying about the swarthy complexion and, not being, this 6'3", apparently perfect man, but, just a really average man. But there was something special about Arnold, and time again, that will keep coming back up, that what is it about Arnold that made people, number one, really like him. He was a really likable guy, but, that were just drawn to him. And here we are today, over 100 years later, still talking about Arnold to all of you today. So there's, he just has this, this charisma that we can't really put our hands on because, of course, we've never met him, but there's something special about him.
I guess the other part is this document's not very legal because Indigenous soldiers weren't allowed to sign up in 1914. So an eye was turned the other way, or it was Logan's charisma and persona that persuaded those to turn the blind eye, but Indigenous soldiers weren't allowed to sign up in 1914. So others that signed up right away, there must be a very interesting story as to why. So the recruiting agent either chose not to notice, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and look the other way. But it'd be interesting to understand that as well for Logan's perspective, how he was able to enlist without being turned away.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah, and so this is a really fantastic photo of the camp when they're arriving in Valcartier, and we can just again imagine coming from this small town, going to St. Thomas, and then traveling, by train to Quebec, which is probably the furthest that at this point he had ever been from home, to being one of the within this group of the first 100 arriving at these camps and just seeing all of the hustle and bustle and the busyness, and soldiers arriving every single day by train, probably full trains, and again, I wonder, this has got to be so exciting, but do you really understand at this point, what you're signing up for? This is a war, right? It's not just this fantastic adventure that's going to, allow you to travel and see things that you might have never seen before, which I think is a motivating factor for maybe some. But at what point does it really kick in that oh, we are actually at war here, right? And so I just really love this photo. I love all of these old photos, and just try to envision what's going through people's thoughts, during these scenes.
Yeah, and I just imagine the hustle and bustle because of, this camp was really hastily put together in August of 1914, and Arnold shows up basically in that first week of September. And I imagine that a lot of the work was being done to get the camp ready. I'm sure a lot of fatigues to lay the plumbing and the electricity for the camp. But it's also where they get sorted out, right? And he becomes part of the 1st Battalion. He also is sorted out in terms of what job he's going to have in the 1st Machine Gun. And I always thought that was really unique because That's a fairly new technology for 1914. It's an underutilized technology. There wasn't a lot of it. And yet whether it's an honor or not, he is chosen to be part of the 1st Machine Gun of the 1st Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And that's a huge deal, especially when you're working with an Indigenous soldier from Muncie, Delaware, right? You're working with somebody who's been an other, right, in Canadian society. So I think that's a real, whether it's an honor or whether that's just Army, the way Army does things, I don't know, but it does lead for some pause for thought.
Mhm. Yeah, do you want to speak to this one? I know
Sure.
you found this photo.
Yeah, finding out about Arnold, you come across these total surprises, and of course, if you're in a library, you can't yell and scream and shout and do. You can't do a dance. Well, you can, but then they pushed you out. But we found a picture of him with his group, and many of these guys were actually part of the 1st Machine Gun section as well. But here he is in the photo, and unfortunately, it's smudged. So the original, when they microfiched the newspaper, it smudged or the image shifted a little bit. So you can't get a very clear view of him. He's the 3rd from the left at the top. And he's got he sort of appears taller and his hat sort of standing a little higher. But the boys at the bottom, so the men, they've got the St. Thomas pennant, right? So they're sending this home. And it appears in the St. Thomas Times Journal. And it's sort of their beginning of following the details of the people who signed up from St. Thomas and where they go when they go across the pond.
Mhm.
So we do know that he boarded the SS Laurentic, which was a luxury liner that was commandeered for war purposes and became a troop transport. So we can only believe how he felt when he boarded that. Here again is a person from Muncie, Delaware, who'd never seen the ocean before. And now he's going on one of the most expensive, boats that you can in order to get transportation to England. We also got family story that he used to take care of the horses. He used to talk to the horses in the language, the Muncie language. And part of his job working with the Machine Gun number 1 was he was a driver for the ammunition. And we've got story that he preferred that job well over working with the machine gun. He never enjoyed that, but he liked working with the horses because that was something that he did back home. So during the trip over, he used to visit down below and visit with the horses and talk with them in the Muncie language. So he was able to use his language, his Indigenous language, but he used it with, I guess, those that he felt most comfortable with, where he wouldn't feel any sort of shame or be outed, I guess, in terms of speaking something different.
Mhm. Yeah, and so that's an illustration from the graphic novel that Ian was talking about earlier that he's working on, just depicting his Arnold's time spent down with the horses underneath. And so this is when we start to get into some really good documentation through newspaper articles. And so now this is was this to St. Thomas Times?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this comes back and it's written from Biggs. And I don't know if you can read it very well, but I did pull out an excerpt from it. And so Biggs writes in February 1915, by the time you get this, we will be in France on our way to the front. And I tell you, we are glad to get out of the mud on the Salisbury Plain. We are driving the ammunition wagon and of course ride the horses. We rode 11 miles last night and every bone in our bodies are stiff and sore. We can hardly walk. We have a nice team and carry ammunition for the machine guns only. We got web equipment in place of the Oliver and now we look like real soldiers. I'm sending you a photo of myself. Arnold can't get his taken for the English camera won't stand the strain of his perfection. We imagine, And then, he talks about being wet as well, but only wet on the outside because they were still teetotalers, which means that they weren't drinking. And so Ian and I were having a conversation about how interesting it was that he made mention of this, right? Because Biggs is English, but Arnold is Indigenous. And I mean, these are, young men, they're 18, 19 years old, and they're in, situations where it's really exciting, where it's really scary. And for a lot of these young men, it's the first time that they're experiencing freedom. And as we all know, sometimes men can get a little, playful when they're together. And so I don't blame them. And in times of high stress, if there was some drinking that was had, but he made a point to say that they weren't drinking, that they were teetotalers and, just drinking tea at this time.
I mean, the clues in the article also tell you that the switchover, so the Canadian equipment wasn't any good. The Oliver equipment that I guess Sam Hughes had spent a lot of money with his friends to, support with, and the Ross rifle. You see the switchover for the Canadian Army to now using the English stuff. And so you get like two accounts here in this article stating that they're so happy to get quality English stuff as opposed to the Canadian substandard, I guess, information or the material that was part of what they went across with.
Yeah, I think he makes mention of having English boots as well, which he's really happy about. But of course, this is written by Biggs, so he's also English, so it might be a little bit nostalgic for him to have those English boots.
We do know that he went across with Biggs in a boat called the SS Architect, and it's a far cry from the Laurentic. It's more of a sort of a more purposeful troop ship, but also a carrier of equipment. And that's in the top left. There's a picture of the machine gun that he may or may not have used. So the technology of the time. His time in France and in Belgium was marred with the fact that he lost a smoke helmet, and a smoke helmet was the early version of a gas mask. And this was right after was the Battle of Ypres, where the Princess Patricias faced the first German gas attack. So I guess the punishment was fairly strong. They took it very seriously, and Arnold was given, because he lost the mask, what was known as field punishment number 1. And I didn't know what it was, but I thought I should take a look and find out. It's essentially where the soldier has to remain standing, but has his hands tied behind his back on a fence or whatnot. And they have to stand there for a certain amount of time. But, if you take a look at his war records, this is the blemish, that you lost a smoke helmet, and therefore you have to stand in front of your soldiers, or you have to stand at a certain location tied up for that loss. So it's an interesting piece, and whether the Canadian Army was really taking it seriously at the time because of that recent gas attack. It just seems like overwhelming punishment for a very minor offense.
It also seems pretty reckless to, lose one of your men over, the threat of, oh, you lost your mask, which is, dangerous. So here, we're going to give you a punishment that is also dangerous, endangers your life. It seems counterintuitive to me, but yeah, luckily that was the only blemish that he's had on his record during his time there. Yeah, and so we got some more newspaper articles here. And so this seems to be a little bit of a saga that gets drawn out. So the first one here talks about 2 men being in the hands of Germans. And so the paper reports that 2 St. Thomas men are prisoners of war, is the opinion of R.J. Miller, who was the captain of the St. Thomas Rifle Association. And then the report goes on to say that Logan and Biggs have not been heard from for some time. An eyewitness declared that the machine gunner section was captured when the Germans charged. Later, the guns were taken and were taken by the British in a magnificent counterattack. But the gunners were now in the hands of the Germans. And then I think that they reference in this article again that he is an Indian and a strong, muscular man of physical physique. So that keeps coming up time and time again for him. And then in the middle newspaper clipping there, they talk about so this is actually written from Biggs, a letter. And he writes that he and Logan got plenty of rifle practice, and that he must say that they make hits occasionally, to judge from the howls that the Germans make. And he writes about one of the horses horses that he was driving being hit with a piece of shell. He took the horse to the vet and the shell was cut out, and Biggs then wanted to keep that shell as a relic. Biggs then talks about another shell almost hitting them, killing one man and wounding others, but that Logan was only cut up a little bit. And then, of course, the last article here is a letter coming in from Logan saying that a shell had burst only 4 feet from him, killing a man who stood between him and the missile. Parts of the shell struck him in the back and his ear, but was also cut by flying metal, but he wasn't seriously injured. In fact, he did not leave the firing line, but continued servicing his machine gun. And so I think that this is really interesting because he dispels something that, first of all, let's go back to the horses. So there's mention of the horses. And so you see that relationship, not just through Logan's relationship with the horses, but Biggs also apparently has like a really good connection to these horses. And then when they're talking about the shrapnel, the shells coming through and being hit by that, or the machine gun practice, I think that this is starting to become more of real for them, right? Like, and he makes that comment that they feel like real soldiers now. He has said that a couple of newspaper articles back, but this one, firing the machine guns and thinking that they're making hits because they're judging from the howls of the Germans, almost seems a little bit like disconnected, like not really actually really understanding what's happening there, when those howls are actually coming from people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is for those who follow World War I. I think this is the first or second Battle of Ypres. So it's Langemarck, and there's a lot of confusion, and there's a salient, I gather, where the Canadian Army and the British Army were sort of surrounded by the Germans on both sides, and that the fire could come from different angles. And I guess that's part and parcel of the confusion as to whether they were wounded or whether they were captured. And I guess news wasn't forthcoming home as they sort of sorted out and dealt with the movement along the front. So, I mean, these articles sort of capture that whole, we're not sure if they're still alive, are they captured, are they going to come home? And again, it's those letters that were lost, unfortunately, but we get those sort of the details within the news articles.
Yeah. And then we come across his war diaries, which were typed, which is fantastic because anybody who's ever looked at, old cursive, it's extremely difficult to decipher at times. So when I came across these war diaries and they were typed, I was so relieved. I was like, yes, this is amazing. And so we do know that on April 26, Arnold Logan was killed. And if I pull out a little bit of the section from the war diary, it's documented that around 6:30 p.m., a smaller mine is reported to have exploded near the trenches 44 and 46. The 1st Battalion at once took position and opened fire within minutes of the mine explosion with excellent effort. At around 7:15 p.m., an attack was launched near the mansion and trench 46. A large caliber shell fell in the midst of this party as it retired and completed its demoralization. Number 1 machine gunner was put out of action along with its entire crew, just as it opened fire on an incoming second attacking party. And so that took place in trench 46, in which machine gunner number 1, Arnold, was part of that. And so 2 years after he had signed up for the war, then we get a clear picture of what had happened within that trench and how his time at the war would now come to an end.
And that wasn't the story that was told by family. So you have a different oral story that was told by family, in that the story that they shared, they didn't share that he was a machine gunner, first off, but that he actually was caught out in no man's land on a scouting mission. So he was caught somewhere outside of the Canadian trenches and was shot out there. And I don't know whether that's that whole clean death philosophy that used to be sent home, or those were the stories that commanding officers would share with grieving relatives, or whether Ernest Biggs shared that when he came home as well. Whether that was, but that was a story that was perpetuated by at least 2 previous generations to me, and then shared, well, how did Arnold die? Well, this is the story. And yet, if you look in the documentation, it's clearly not true. So where did that story originate? And that's another beautiful piece of oral history, oral story, and the beauty of Muncie oral storytelling. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that we're here talking about Private Logan, our great uncle, but that inevitably is going to be intertwined with talking about Biggs because they were inseparable. They were constantly together. This war diary doesn't, mention any names. And we do know that Biggs and Arnold were together in the war. They were part of the same group. But for whatever reason, Biggs wasn't there on this day.
Right.
And we don't really know why.
It's a great way to be dismissed from your job. Just you're killed in action.
Yeah.
So the Père Marquette noted that in their employee files that he'd passed away. No reason, no cause for dismissal.
just death. Yeah, and so coming back to Biggs, Logan died April 26th to be precise, and then May 5th there is a newspaper article where Biggs is writing, and it's saying, Biggs is saying, "Well, Captain, I'm very sorry to report that poor Arnold was killed at his gun. Oh, how I miss him, for we have been together for so long and being on the same gun crew together. At the time he was killed, I just happened not to be there. We had been together constantly until the day he was killed, and I was not there when he was hit. I am glad to report, however, though, that he never suffered as he was killed outright. I saw him after he was dead. There were 8 men on that same gun with Arnold, and 7 were killed, and the 8th lost his sight. Oh, I hope this war will be over soon. It is awful. I had 18 months out there, and that is plenty for me." And so when I was thinking earlier, like, when does this become real for them? Like, when does, this war and being a soldier in this war actually come with all of the, not that I'm rooting for them to have a terrible time, not by any means, but I mean, that is what war is. And it's quite evident at this time that he's had enough, right? And now he's lost his best friend. It's time to get out of there. He just wants to go home.
And I guess as per was the time, Arnold's death is actually listed in other newspapers in Canada. So the one to the right is actually from Ottawa. So they give you a record of who had passed away that week or that day. And then it's his very short service record. So there's very few entries except for his leave and losing his smoke helmet. So the actual active service document is not all that helpful, but it's all the other stuff around there that actually helps you get a good idea of who Arnold was. And the word lucky is not right, but he has a known grave. So he was one of the soldiers that was given the burial and was given a grave at the Hoog Crater Cemetery, which is just outside of Ypres, Belgium. So that's his casualty card and then subsequently his burial card.
But you've actually been to that site, or?
Yeah, I chose to walk from Ypres and the Menin Gate out to his grave, which I'll not do again because that was literally 7 miles. And I was carrying my big pack because I was with my friend and we wanted to go out to the cemeteries. What's sobering though is the number of cemeteries that are on either side of you. It's like a big graveyard. From going from Ypres all the way to Hoog Crater, you must have walked past, I don't know, a dozen cemeteries, large and small, from the Great War.
Mm-hmm.
This is an interesting piece because this has been in the family since the obituary was published in 1916. So someone clipped out the Times Journal article, glued it onto the back of a piece of cardboard, and kept it most likely on a dresser. So I have the original. This is the photograph of the original newspaper from that time. And also the handwriting of my great-grandfather is on the envelope. So it was kept through it's My math's not good. It's 105 years old, right? It's 105 years old now since 1916, and it has been passed through different generations along the way, and it still exists. So I guess that's a testament to the fact that this guy only lived 19 years, and yet he was so well loved or so well liked that the material still exists. And to that point, both Terry and I are, actively researching his life. So, he's that well-liked individual back in 1914 when he signed up and made an impression, and he's still making an impression to this day.
Yeah, and I would say in this photo too, he kind of like we talked about him looking like a little boy to being more buff, and then in this photo, I'm reminded that he kind of looks like a little boy again.
And that's a picture of the cemetery. I think the cemetery's got about 2,000 burials, and it's sort of a depression, so it looks like a hill. And I think it was actually a crater that had been filled in, and then they organized the graves after the war, and then brought him there. And that's his tombstone there. So this is interesting. Out on our reserve, there is a tombstone to the Logan family that was given by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Engineers, which was a sort of a social organization, but an organization that advocated for those two groups back in 1916 and earlier. But on top is actually a carving, a marble carving of a Canadian soldier, which they say is a likeness of Arnold. And what's interesting is that usually these are often seen outside of county buildings, township buildings, or city buildings, right? Because they're fairly expensive to produce. I would argue in 1916 or sorry, 1918 when this was put up, that those are usually reserved for much bigger venues than a reserve setting and just a simple cemetery. And again, it goes back to the fact that how well loved or how well liked was this man, that he has a tombstone that is purchased by the Brotherhood, and yet he only worked for the railway for 1.5 years. And they've put this out on the reserve with a massive marble likeness of him on top. And it's still out there. It still exists. And that's a picture taken in probably in the 1920s. Silly me, my grandmother was telling me all the people who are in that photo, and I forgot to write them down. And she's no longer with us, but she was detailing who exactly was sitting around the stone. But that's a piece that we're trying to figure out as to was it because they thought he was the first Canadian Indian to sign up for the war? Was it because of his personality, his likability, his meaning to St. Thomas and to the community? What was the interest in a very short time period employee to get such a massive memorial? And that's a piece that we're still trying to figure out and understand.
Yeah, particularly like being an Indian, which, like they still called them at that time, if they were lucky, like there was still the term savage used, right? And he belonged to that group. And then to have like this memorial dedicated and made for him is such a respectful thing to do for somebody who generally did not get respect, who belonged to a group of people that did not get respect at this time. So again, that comes back to that question of what was so special about Logan? What made people like him so much? What was that charisma?
I guess another thing to point out is that oftentimes there are other Indigenous soldiers who are highlighted of their World War I service. The sniper from Perry Island, Francis Pegamagabo, is one of them. And yet, just 25 minutes southwest of London is a very rather large memorial to a soldier who's not been highlighted. Yeah. And it was done in during wartime because unfortunately his brothers couldn't attend the actual unveiling. They basically put the stone up, and because nobody was available because they're all involved with the war work, this stone was just put up. And yet, there's a testimonial to somebody, an Indigenous soldier that has lasted for 103 years, right? Mm-hmm. Amazing. We held an anniversary on the 100th anniversary of his death. We held sort of a celebration out on Muncie, where we booked the community hall. Family members came, but also community members came. And we highlighted his time. So we put out all the material that we've been able to find about him, and we're able to share. The problem with that is that we were tapped to now do the powwow, and we hold a powwow on the July long weekend. So suddenly now Arnold was going to be commemorated at the powwow. And of course, that placed a lot more organization on me and my family, but it was a real awesome way to highlight his service to a man that maybe most have forgotten, right? They may know that his statue's in the cemetery, but many don't know him. That generation is long gone. So it was a really wonderful time to actually come together as family and try and highlight his short life.
Yeah, and for me, I've lived in this area most of my life, and I didn't know Arnold existed until a couple of years ago when I was in my undergrad. So unfortunately, at this time in 2016, there was no connection there for me. I mean, I wasn't even aware of the story at all. And, here I am a couple of years later, adding to the story as a direct relative is really exciting. And I wish I would have been there in 2016. But And so, this is that photo that you all seen at the beginning of the presentation. And as you can see from the different photos that we presented throughout, it ebbs and flows in his looks. And this is one of those photos where he looks like very boyish, right? Very innocent, very boyish, but he's dressed really, really nice. And so I just wanted to leave you with this as you look into that face that is just perfection, if I can say. My name is Arnold Logan. What can I tell you? I just got leave from my job with the Pierre Marquette. I have worked there for a couple of years as a fireman. Not the best job, but it is a job. Shoveling coal all day, the army won't seem so hard. I live in St. Thomas, but I didn't always. I gave my last rent money because we are leaving soon. Anyways, I have some packing to do. Until next time. That is it.
Anishi Kwamoan. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, Anishik Miigwech. Not sure what the timing is.
Oh, okay. There's a couple questions we could, yeah. If there's a couple questions, we're more than happy to take a few.
Terry and Ian, thank you so much for the talk you really shared with us today. In my opinion, a masterclass of researching one life that was impacted during the First World War. Perhaps we could go back to one aspect that I would like to maybe elaborate on, because we are lucky to have many students here who are also working on First World War soldier research, and it is his cause of death. Ian, you mentioned that you grew up listening to family stories that contradicted the written record, whereas Terry has recently compiled research where, correct me if I'm wrong, you only knew the written record for a period of time. So I'm wondering, how do we reconcile those two stories, and how do we maybe come to terms with that they are two different stories of the same event?
It's a good question. And when Terry shared those details of the trench getting hit by the shell, I'd read enough that I thought that it was that we don't really want to share the details back home of the actual gory death of someone and getting hit by a German shell. I can only imagine what that did to a human body. So it's that whole they died a clean death as opposed to a horribly mangled death. I guess the only part of that that I need to come to grips with is that the size of those German shells and the way that they explode, they were able to find the bodies of the crew and actually give them a burial as opposed to listing their name on the men in gate because they couldn't find them or they'd completely vaporized. So my only concern was that the story then changed from what was reported in the news, and that Biggs maybe shared the story back home with Arnold's relatives that it was a cleaner death than what actually happened. So that's one way that I think with the way that the story has changed. And I don't know, Indigenous storytelling can sometimes change over the years in terms of the way, way people interpret things. And it makes for a wonderfully rich story in terms of the way it changes. And of course, you'd have to then sit with various generations to actually hear the different versions of the story, right? So I never heard the story from my great grandfather, but I heard it from my grandmother, who had heard it from her dad and from Willis, her uncle, all of the ways in which this story perpetuated. And it's one of those awesome things as a history researcher where, you've been told one thing, you find out the other. So which one is more valuable? For me, I find the story really valuable because it was several generations old. And it allows me, the historian, to go, okay, I know what's written on paper, I know what the official record is, but I wonder why they decided to go with this piece. And it sort of honors that Indigenous ways of storytelling of that side of my family.
Yeah, and I think you hit on it at the very beginning, right? We want to remember our loved ones in strength-based ways, right? And so we don't need to really include those details that might be, hurtful or like upsetting for people to know, right? But we can still tell that story in a way that somewhat reflects, like, he did die, but maybe it wasn't in this way; it was in a different way, right? And it's just all about remembering our loved ones in that really, strength-based way.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks very much for your talk. It's very interesting and great to hear some of this research. I've got two questions that are kind of interrelated. One is about that. They're both kind of on the memory and the legacy of Arnold, kind of going forward. So the first one I kind of have was, you mentioned that the memorial is quite unique, and I would agree. It seems very interesting that he's got this statue to him. I was kind of wondering, as one question was kind of, is he the only one that has any sort of commemoration? Is there like a community memorial was put up? I know that the Six Nations and Brantford did put up a community memorial there. So I'm wondering, did the Munsee Delaware Nation do the same thing, or is Logan kind of just by himself for some reason? As you said, it's unclear. Mm-hmm. My second kind of question is kind of, how does his father kind of play a bigger role as well? Because you mentioned that he was chief, seems very politically active. As you said, he was a conservative, and he said, particularly after the war in commemoration, I've read some of his speeches, some of the stuff he said, and he's very pro British, yes. Which seems very kind of interesting. And so I'm kind of wondering, how does his father come into kind of this legacy of how do we remember Arnold? And I'm wondering, did he play some sort of a role in getting that statue? Is there any kind of evidence coming out for how his father also has a role to play in his story?
Yeah, so I think to the first point, the memorial for Arnold is the only one for a soldier that is out on Munsee. So again, like it's coming back to that specialness that Arnold had, right? And there's a lot of questions as to even why the Brotherhood of Locomotive and Firemen and Engineers made it, and they made it in such fast time, right? Like the war was still happening when the statue was put up. So we don't really have those answers. We don't know why it was put there. And at the same time, we don't know why like other soldiers weren't commemorated, unless you have an answer to that.
I don't. I know they appear on the I think the memorial at Chippewa of the Thames.
Yeah.
So Muncie veterans are there as well. But as to a specific memorial, there may have been something that existed previous, but I don't. I know it's commemorated at Mount Elgin in the notes for Mount Elgin of the boys that served across the ocean.
Yeah, who fought for the empire.
But a
Yeah.
physical monument, there is no outside of Chippewa. There's one.
Yeah.
Scobai is a character, and I'd love to know more about him. In fact, I'd like to actually just have an hour of his time, if that were possible. He's an enigma. He is very pro-conservative and writes to John A. Frequently. He's a multiple time elected chief of Muncie. He's gone across the ocean and worked with the Quakers in Philadelphia to petition for Muncie land. And he went right to the Queen. Now, we don't know whether he actually got audience with the Queen, but he spent time in England doing a tour, right, to raise subscriptions and money for the Muncie people. I imagine he'd be fairly influential for his son, but I don't know if he's the ideal dad. He tends to spend a lot of time away from home, and his mom, Arnold's mom, has epilepsy. And it's mostly Henry who's taking care of the elderly grandfather who's taking care of the kids. So I don't know how much Scobai influenced Arnold. I mean, certainly to have a global perspective, most definitely, right? Like here's an Indigenous man who's gone everywhere an Indigenous man could, I gather, at that time. The United States, gone to England, come back, but he's more interested in his political aspirations and I guess what's happening next rather than stay on Muncie. And, through family, we don't know a whole lot about Scobai. And I think there's a reason why we don't know a lot about Scobai that we have to find out through our research, simply because he seems to be that while he's a person bigger than, larger than life, he's also that ghost in terms of family. And I think that's, and again, if Arnold went to residential school before he was 10, the actual connection with the parent would be fairly minimal, right? Yeah. Love to know more about him. If I could time travel and just spend an hour with him, I think I'd be just mind blown. And Ashik, thank you.
We have a question from the online audience. When you were doing the story of, they thank you, first of all, and then they say, when you are doing the story of Arnold, are you also translating to Lenape, and what are some of the Lenape words you have learned? What are some of the Muncie word? I mean, what is the Muncie word for war/Great War?
So you're the language.
Yeah, this seems to be a question from somebody I should know out there. Anyways, so we're actually translating the graphic novel, sort of a pictorial of his time into the Muncie language. One of the interesting words that I found out, Zuksanene, is the word for railway. And Zuk is the color black in the language. So it's reference to the color of the engines at the time, or the coal that was being put into them. And it represents, it sort of gives you that more in-depth view that Indigenous languages have, that richer detail about a word. As for war, there are no words for war or conflict that exist in our dictionary. There's very few, and that's a challenge. We had the pleasure of translating a poem for a man named John Moses, who's a curator at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. And of course, my colleague Karen Moscow and I had to actually come up with words for conflict or battles or war, or for modern things that happened in World War I, such as in this case, it was about, he was a pilot. This Indigenous person was a pilot. So we had to come up with all sorts of words for that. But I think the most unique one was, from a descriptive standpoint, was that word for describing railways, a modern technology, but taking it apart and going, Zuk meant black, and it described the engine plus the coal plus the tracks. And you've got that connection that you don't get from English language, right? Locomotive, railway, they're just words. Whereas in the Munsee language, you get something much more powerful. Mhm, and a sheik.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was amazing. I wanted to go back to the multiple accounts of his death really quick. I'm also doing research on a soldier from London, and it's sort of a similar situation where I was able to get a hold of someone from his family, and they have a very different account of his death. But in this case, the family account is very grim compared to the official account. So the family member told me that he died from sort of a friendly grenade where the soldier pulled the pin in the trench and everyone blew up. Where the official history is much more like heroic, I guess, in the portrayal. So I'm kind of wondering, to me as sort of researcher, I felt pretty indifferent's not the right word, but to me it didn't really matter how he died, because when I put together sort of the body of work of his life, I felt like I had a pretty good idea, no matter how he died, of who he was and all that. But as sort of family members, does it matter to you sort of how those last moments went?
Not for me. Like I can resonate with what you're saying. Like, you know, it doesn't really matter. If somebody died, it doesn't really matter to me. What is more important to me is remembering them in, you know, those more strength-based ways, right? And not really focusing on the death of the individual, because that's something that's, you know, inevitable. It's something that's going to happen to all of us, in fact, right? And so just to keep it more positive and remember people in the ways that we want to remember them, even if that means altering the story just a little bit to, you know, to protect people's feelings, or, you know, to remember somebody as that reminder to remember them in a better way.
I guess the thing from a researching standpoint is that having that information of the shell hitting the crew does allow you to go back into the records and find out who actually passed away that day in the Army records. And so you get to actually find the cross section of, so these guys worked together for 2 years. There must have been some fairly good friendships, but it also then allows you then to maybe reach out to families of those soldiers to find out if there's any missing pieces of information that could help, or actually hear whether that story is unique for our family, or whether other families told a different story. And I think that's the beauty part. If I could quit my job and not have to work on my PhD, I'd have lots of time to explore those pieces, right? Because they must have been really tight, that crew. I mean, I believe they were all made up of St. Thomas people, and they would have had railway stories. They would have had stories whether they're recent immigrants or whether they've been longtime inhabitants of Turtle Island. So, I mean, it gives you that window into maybe I can get more story that, you know, the details of, you know, Trench 46, Trench 45 was hit by a German shell at 6:30 p.m. You know, it's that human thing. Yeah. We can probably take one more question, I think. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you again for your presentation. It again was amazing. This question's more for Terry as you go and sit down. But as you mentioned, you had only really discovered this ancestor of yours through your research. And with that, I was wondering how that impacted how you then researched and wrote about Arnold, and then further what it generally has meant for your family to find this relative and him have such just an amazing story.
Yeah. So I was looking through a whole bunch of documentations, and some names started kind of reoccurring and popping up. And as I started to put the puzzle pieces together, I was like, oh my goodness, this person is actually related to me. So this person is in my family line here. And so of course that kind of alters the way that I'm doing my research now, because I'm now way more passionate and way more invested. Not that, you know, we're not invested into our research projects in the beginning, but when you can have that personal connection, it automatically is going to generate more passion. And so it has led from this project, it has led into a constant evolving process of continuing to look for a whole bunch of information. And of course, like family members, right, that I didn't know existed. And finding out all of this information has really brought, like, it's made my family bigger, it's made my family richer, and it's answered a lot of questions you know, that couldn't be answered before, right? So, for instance, the way that I'm connected to the story is Arnold is my great uncle. So his brother, who is a half brother, is my great grandpa, and so his let me see, I'm getting a little confused here. So yeah, his brother, his half brother, was my great grandfather, and so that makes Arnold's mother my great grandmother, or third great grandmother, correct? Right. Yes. And so she was married to Skabaya, and so because there's a half brother, so Skabaya is not related to me. I'm only related to Arnold's mother. And there's not a lot of information about her. And so when I go through my maternal side of the family line, I have been coming to stops. And then this was just one extra piece of information that I was able to kind of put together. And in that obituary, so Isabella was Skabaya's wife's name. And so she was put into the London Psychiatric, or well, it's called back then it was called the Insane Asylum. And so there's not a lot of information about her. And that obituary has at the very bottom, you know, it's talking about Logan's father being Monsignor, I think with some degree of French, I think is the exact quote. And then it says his mother Isabella is, and then it stops. And I'm like, is what? Because I've been like dying to find out more about Isabella. So yeah, it's just, it's created this ongoing process of just continuing to research and find more of those pieces to put together to create a whole story, a whole piece to my family.